The screech of tires on wet asphalt usually meant someone was about to die. Lorenzo Moretti knew that sound the way other men knew their mother's voice, intimately, viscerally, without having to think about it. In his world, that sound preceded a body. A contract fulfilled. A message sent. It did not precede a child. He'd been leaving the Meridian Tower, adjusting his cufflinks on the sidewalk outside, platinum, custom engraved, a gift he'd bought himself the day he took over Chicago's South Side. His three-piece charcoal suit was impeccable. His schedule was full. He had a council meeting in 40 minutes, a weapons shipment to authorize, and a trader to deal with before sundown. Lorenzo Moretti did not have time for emergencies that weren't his. He never did. 1 second before, he had been reaching into his jacket for his phone. 1 second after, his body was already moving. Not because he decided to. He didn't decide anything. The calculation didn't happen. The cold, ruthless machinery in his chest that weighed every risk, every cost, every variable before he so much as blinked, it went completely silent. And he ran. She was standing in the dead center of Michigan Avenue. 4 years old, maybe 5. Brown hair. A blue sweater with a small yellow star on the chest. White sneakers that hadn't been white for long. And in her arms, pressed against her like a shield that couldn't protect anything, a brown teddy bear with one loose button eye. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't running. She was just standing there, staring up at the 18-wheeler barreling toward her at a speed that left no room for error, her small face frozen in an expression he recognized, the same look men got in the final second before they understood they were going to die. 30 tons of steel. Burning rubber. The stench of diesel thick enough to taste. Lorenzo hit the pavement on the other side of the truck's path with the girl locked against his chest, his shoulder taking the full impact of the fall, asphalt tearing through the wool of his jacket and into the skin beneath. He felt the truck's wind drag at his hair. Felt the heat of the engine press against his back like an open oven. Heard the deafening roar of it pass so close that the vibration moved through the bones of his arms. Then silence. Then the child began to cry. He lay there for exactly 1 second, Lorenzo Moretti, the Iron King, face pressed to the filthy street of Chicago, breathing. Just breathing. The teddy bear had landed 3 feet away, staring up at the gray sky with its mismatched button eyes. "You're all right," he said. His voice came out low and unfamiliar to his own ears, stripped of its usual command, scraped raw. "You're safe. I have you." He hadn't said anything like that since he was 19 years old. He sat up, cradling the girl against his chest, scanning the street with the trained instinct of a man who never let his guard down for long. The crowd had gathered at the edges, phones out, faces pale, the usual theater of disaster. His men were already moving in from 2 directions. Dante, his head of security, was speaking rapidly into his earpiece 30 feet away. 4 black Escalades appeared within 90 seconds. Tinted windows. No plates. They moved through the frozen traffic with the kind of practiced authority that didn't require badges or sirens. The crowd understood immediately. He watched them change the way a room changes when lightning strikes nearby. Phone screens lowered. Eyes dropped. An older woman on the corner pulled her grandson behind her without looking back. 2 men in construction gear suddenly found the scaffolding above them very interesting. Someone whispered a name. The whole block went quiet. Lorenzo stood, the girls still held against him, and turned to find the crowd had parted. Dante approached, face unreadable in the professional way Lorenzo had trained him. "We have a vehicle en route, sir." "We can." "Not yet." He was looking at the child. She'd stopped crying. She was staring at him with eyes the color of dark amber, eyes that were oddly, terribly familiar in a way he couldn't immediately name. Her small hand had found the lapel of his ruined jacket and was holding on with a grip that surprised him. He had saved her. He had expected what? Gratitude from bystanders. A clean exit. A story as men would retell with exaggerated reverence. He had not expected to feel anything. He had not expected those eyes. Lorenzo. The voice came from behind him. One word. His name, spoken in a tone that carried 10 years of silence inside it. He turned slowly. The way a man turns when some part of him already knows, and is buying himself one last moment before he has to know it completely. She was standing at the edge of the cleared space his men had made. Dark hair. A gray coat. Hands pressed flat against her sides the way she used to stand when she was trying not to show fear, a habit he had once found endearing and had later used against her. Isabella Vance. 10 years. Not a single day of contact. Not a word. She was staring at him the way people stare at things that are supposed to be gone, with the specific kind of horror reserved for ghosts that have the audacity to show up in broad daylight and be real. Her eyes moved to the child in his arms. His eyes moved back to the child's face. He had always been fast. It was his greatest asset, not his fists, not his resources, not the empire he'd built on the bones of better men. It was the speed of his mind. The ability to process information and arrive at the truth before anyone else in the room had finished asking the question. He arrived at it now. It hit him the way the pavement had sudden, total, leaving no room for doubt. The ember eyes. The shape of the chin. The way she held on without letting go. Lorenzo Moretti, who had not been shocked by anything in over a decade, stood in the middle of Michigan Avenue in his ruined $3,000 suit, holding a child he had saved without thinking, and felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he knew. Nobody moved. That was the thing about Lorenzo Moretti. When he went still, the world around him went still too. His men had learned it years ago. The crowd had learned it in the last 30 seconds. Even the girl in his arms had learned it, her crying reduced now to small, hitching breaths against his shoulder, one small fist still balled in the lapel of his jacket. Only Isabella moved. One step forward. Then she stopped herself, the way someone stops at the edge of something they aren't sure will hold their weight. Give her to me. Her voice was controlled. That hadn't changed. Isabella Vance had always been the kind of woman who bled quietly, who kept everything she felt behind a wall of composure so practiced it looked effortless. He had once admired it. Later, he had understood that she had built it because of men like him. Lorenzo didn't move. She's not hurt. I can see that. Give her to me. He transferred the child carefully, watching the way Isabella's arms came around her, tight, practiced, the grip of a mother who had done this 10,000 times, who knew the exact amount of pressure that meant safe without meaning scared. The girl buried her face in Isabella's neck. The teddy bear was retrieved by one of his men and placed, without a word, into Isabella's free hand. A small mercy. Dante was good at reading rooms. Isabella pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head and kept them there for a long moment. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry. That told him everything about the kind of years she'd had, the kind that teach you to save the falling apart for later, for private, for when no one is watching. You can go, she said. Isabella. You saved her. Thank you. You can go. She turned. He let her take 4 steps before he spoke again, low enough that only she could hear it above the ambient noise of the city resuming around them, horns, voices, the ordinary machinery of Chicago reasserting itself over the extraordinary. She has your eyes. Isabella stopped walking. Not your eyes, he almost said. He'd been wrong about that, looking at the girl's face, cataloging in the automatic way he cataloged everything. The amber. That was Isabella. But the shape, the set of them, the particular way they had looked at him without blinking, without flinching. He knew that look. He had seen it in mirrors. She turned back slowly. The composure was still there, but something beneath it had shifted, the way a fault line shifts, invisible on the surface until it isn't. Don't. One word. A warning and a plea at once. How old is she? Lorenzo. How old? The city moved around them. A cab leaned on its horn 2 blocks over. Somewhere above, a window opened and then closed. The girl had gone quiet against Isabella's shoulder, her small hand tangled absently in her mother's dark hair. 4, Isabella said. She's 4. He did the math the way he did everything, fast, precise, without flinching from the answer. He'd cut contact 10 years ago. Cleanly, completely, with the particular cruelty of a man who tells himself he's being merciful when he is only being cowardly. And then, a year later, she would have already known. A year later, she had been carrying something he hadn't given her the chance to tell him. He looked at Isabella. He had become very good, over the years, at looking at things he had broken and feeling nothing. It was a skill, a survival mechanism. The same way soldiers learn to step over what they've left behind without breaking stride. He found, standing on Michigan Avenue in the ruins of his composure, that the skill had limits. You should have told me, he said. Something moved across her face, quick, hot, there and gone. I tried. She said it simply, without heat, which was somehow worse than if she'd shouted it. Twice. Your people turned me away at the door. The third time, I got the message. He had no answer for that. He knew, without needing to verify it, that it was true. In those days his standing orders had been absolute, no personal visitors, no unscheduled contact, nothing that could be used as leverage. He had been building an empire and burning everything else to the ground to do it. He hadn't cared what he was burning. He hadn't known what he was burning. What's her name? The question came out before he could decide whether he had the right to ask it. Isabella studied him for a long moment. The girl shifted in her arms, turning her face toward him with the uncanny, unself-conscious curiosity of small children, the ones too young to understand that some things are dangerous to look at directly. Sophia, Isabella said. Something locked in his chest. He didn't show it. He was very good at not showing things. But for a single, unguarded second, the name hit him the way the pavement had, full force, no cushion, no warning. Sophia. She's mine. He said it quietly. It wasn't a question. He was watching Isabella's face for the denial, the correction, the reasonable explanation he needed her to give him, because if she gave him one, he could walk away from the street and return to his life and lock this moment in the same vault where he kept everything else he refused to feel. Isabella didn't give it to him. She held his gaze, and her silence was the most honest thing she had offered him in 10 years. Come with me, he said. Absolutely not. Isabella. He kept his voice level. Patient. The tone he used when a negotiation had moved past posturing into something real. You were standing on a public street when a runaway truck nearly killed your daughter. My daughter. And in 90 seconds, every person on this block with a phone has footage of me pulling her out of the road. Do you understand what that means? He watched her process it. She'd always been quick. It was one of the things about her that had made her dangerous to him in the early days, before he decided that love was a liability he couldn't afford. She understood before he finished explaining. Your enemies, she said quietly. My enemies now know I have something worth taking. He glanced at Sophia, at his daughter, and the words still didn't feel real, still felt like a stone in his mouth he couldn't quite swallow. My car is on the corner. My house is fortified. Whatever you think of me, and I have no doubt you've had years to compile a thorough list, you are not safe here. She is not safe here. Isabella looked down at Sophia. The girl was watching him over her mother's shoulder with those amber eyes, calm now, curious, utterly unafraid in the specific way of children who don't yet know enough to understand what fear is for. She looked back up at him. And he saw the exact moment she made the calculation he hated her for having to make, the one where she weighed her pride against her daughter's life and arrived at the only answer a mother could. If you touch a single hair on her head, Isabella said, I will burn everything you've built to the ground myself. He believed her. That hadn't changed either. I know, he said. He turned and walked toward the car. After a moment, he heard her footsteps behind him, measured, reluctant, real. In his chest, something he had declared dead a long time ago turned over once, like an ember catching air. He told himself it was nothing. He had been lying to himself for 10 years. He was practiced at it. It didn't feel like nothing. He changed his mind in the car. That was the truth of it, stripped of everything else. Somewhere between the corner of Michigan Avenue and the on-ramp to the I-90, with Sophia asleep against Isabella's arm and the city pulling away behind the tinted glass, Lorenzo Moretti made a decision that he told himself was tactical. He would take them somewhere neutral. A hotel, one of the 3 he owned under a shell company, clean and anonymous, the kind of place where discretion was baked into the rates. He would post 2 men outside the door. He would arrange new transit documents, a car, whatever Isabella needed to disappear to wherever she'd been living her life for the last 4 years without him. He would be generous. He would be efficient. He would let them go. He had destroyed her once by holding on. The least he could do now was destroy her correctly, by letting her leave. The Aldine, he said to Dante, who nodded without turning. The partition went up. In the back seat, Isabella sat with her spine straight and her eyes forward, Sophia's sleeping weight draped across her lap. She hadn't spoken since they'd gotten in the car. Neither had he. The silence between them was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that had weight and temperature, the kind that remembered things. They were 6 minutes from the hotel when Lorenzo's phone buzzed. He read the message once. Then he looked up at the back of Dante's head. "Change of route," he said. Now. The Escalade shifted lanes in one smooth motion. Behind them, the second car followed without needing to be told. Dante had been with Lorenzo for 11 years. He didn't ask questions when the voice came out like that. Isabella noticed. Of course she did. What happened? Nothing. Lorenzo. It's being handled. She turned to look at him then fully, the way she used to when he was deflecting, and she had decided she was done pretending not to notice. The years had sharpened her. Whatever softness he remembered had been refined down to something harder and more precise, like steel that had been through the fire enough times to know its own tensile strength. Someone knows she was in that street, Isabella said. Not a question. He said nothing, which was answer enough. She looked down at Sophia, still sleeping, one small hand curled open against her knee. Something moved across Isabella's face, not panic, not tears. Something quieter and more dangerous. The settling of a woman who has spent 4 years preparing for a threat she always knew might come and is now looking directly at it. How bad? She asked. Manageable. That's not what I asked. He turned to the window. The city scrolled past, familiar blocks, familiar landmarks, a life he had built street by street over 15 years. He knew this city the way a surgeon knows a body, where it was strong, where it was fragile, exactly where to cut. He also knew his enemies. The footage from the street would have moved fast, it always did. And there were men in this city who had spent years looking for a crack in his armor, a pressure point, something they could use. He had been careful never to give them one. No family. No attachments. Nothing that could be leveraged. In 90 seconds on Michigan Avenue, all of that had ended. They were 4 blocks from the Aldine when the black sedan pulled alongside them. Lorenzo saw it half a second before it happened, the window dropping too fast, the angle wrong, a shape inside that shouldn't be there. Half a second was enough. He was already moving, already reaching across the seat, already covering both of them with his body when the first shot punched through the rear passenger window and buried itself in the door panel where Isabella's head had been. The car erupted. Dante drove the way Lorenzo had trained him, no braking, no panic, hard left into the next street, and then immediately right, putting 2 corners between them and the shooter in under 8 seconds. The second Escalade peeled off behind them to intercept. Outside, Lorenzo heard the percussion of a brief, ugly exchange, and then nothing. He pushed himself upright. Glass in his hair. His pulse elevated, not from fear, he registered, but from something more specific and more alarming. He turned. Isabella had Sophia pressed flat against the seat beneath her, covering the girl's body with her own, her eyes open and scanning the interior of the car with the rapid, methodical focus of someone assessing damage, not falling apart. "Are you hit?" he said. "No." She sat up slowly, pulling Sophia with her. The girl was awake now, confused and frightened, her mouth open in the prelude to crying. Isabella put her lips to her ear and said something low, something Lorenzo couldn't hear, and Sophia's face slowly closed back down from the edge of terror. He watched her do it. He watched the patient, practice certainty of it, the way Isabella poured calm into the girl like something she had an inexhaustible supply of, even now, even here, with glass on the seat and a bullet hole 18 inches from where she'd been sitting. That was a message, Isabella said, once Sophia had subsided into a trembling quiet. She wasn't looking at him. She was still watching her daughter. Yes. They moved fast. They were already watching me. The street gave them everything they needed. She was quiet for a moment. When she looked at him, the last of whatever she'd been holding onto, some version of the afternoon where she collected her daughter and walked away from Lorenzo Moretti forever, was gone from her eyes, replaced by something clear and hard and entirely without illusion. "The hotel won't work," she said. "No." "Then where?" He had been avoiding the answer since Michigan Avenue. He had constructed alternatives, the hotel, a safe house in Bridgeport, arrangements at a distance that would let him solve this problem without solving the larger one. Without sitting across a dinner table from Isabella Vance every night while the city burned around them and something old and unfinished moved through the walls like a draft through an old house. There was only one place with the security she needed. The only place in Chicago where his enemies would have to breach 4 perimeter walls, 12 armed guards, and a man who had been waiting 11 years for someone to try, before they got close enough to touch her. "My house," he said. Isabella's jaw tightened. He watched her weigh it, pride on one side, Sophia on the other. He had been calculating that specific equation since the car pulled away from the curb, and he had known how it would resolve. He was not proud of knowing. He was not proud of much tonight. "This isn't permanent," she said. "No. The moment it's safe. You'll leave." "I know." He turned back to the window. "I'm not trying to keep you, Isabella." She didn't answer. But from the corner of his eye, he saw her pull Sophia closer, press her mouth to the girl's hair, close her eyes briefly against the top of her daughter's head. His daughter. The words still wouldn't settle. It kept moving through him the way the truck's wind had moved through him on the street. Total, disorienting, impossible to brace for even when you saw it coming. Outside, Chicago slid past in streaks of light. Dante drove without speaking. In the back seat, Lorenzo Moretti, who had not let anyone close to him in 10 years, sat 6 inches from the only 2 people in the world who could undo him. He stared at the city he owned and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like it wasn't enough. The Moretti estate was beautiful the way a mausoleum is beautiful, grand, immaculate, and built for permanence rather than life. Isabella understood this within the first hour. The ceilings were high and the light was good, and every surface had been chosen by someone with genuine taste. The guest wing where they'd been installed was larger than her entire apartment in Cincinnati, 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a bathroom with heated floors and a soaking tub she would not allow herself to appreciate. There were fresh flowers on the dresser. Soft towels rolled in the bathroom like a hotel that had decided to become a fortress. She sat on the edge of the bed after Sophia had finally gone to sleep and looked at the flowers and felt her jaw ache from how long she had been holding it tight. 12 hours ago, she had been buying Sophia a hot chocolate from the cart on the corner. She had been thinking about the grocery list and a work deadline and whether Sophia's blue coat still fit or whether she needed to order the next size up. Now she was inside the home of the man who had broken her, guarded by men with earpieces, because someone had put a bullet through a car window at her head. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a very long time. The estate operated on its own logic, and that logic was Lorenzo. She saw this by the second morning. The staff moved with a particular kind of efficiency, quiet, anticipatory, never in the wrong place. Meals appeared. Sophia's scattered toys were returned to a neat arrangement by the time they came back to the room. A selection of children's books materialized on the low table by the window, their spines uncracked, still carrying the faint smell of a bookshop. Someone had noted what Sophia liked, or guessed it correctly, which was almost worse. Isabella did not thank him for any of it. She was not ungrateful, she simply understood that gratitude was a door, and she could not afford to open any doors inside this house. Sophia had no such reservations. She found him on the third morning. Isabella had been in the sitting room with her laptop, trying to salvage the week's work remotely, when she realized the particular quality of silence that meant Sophia was somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. She followed it through the corridor and down the wide staircase to the ground-floor study and stopped in the doorway. Lorenzo was at his desk. Papers in front of him, phone face down, reading glasses she had never seen before pushed up his nose. Sophia was standing 18 inches away, at the precise boundary between polite curiosity and outright invasion, holding her teddy bear and watching him with the focused attention she usually reserved for things she was about to take apart. He hadn't noticed Isabella in the door. He was looking at Sophia. Something had happened to his face. She didn't have a clean word for it. The architecture of it was the same, the sharp jaw, the controlled set of his mouth, but something underneath had shifted, the way a current shifts beneath a surface that stays still. He was looking at the girl the way people look at things they don't know how to hold. "What's his name?" Sophia said, pointing at a small bronze sculpture on the corner of the desk. "A horse, mid-stride." Lorenzo looked at it. "He doesn't have one." Sophia considered this with the gravity of a small judge. "He should. He looks fast." "He does," Lorenzo agreed. "I'd call him Rocket." A pause. Then, very quietly, so quietly Isabella almost missed it, Lorenzo said, "Rocket." As if he were filing it away. As if the name now belonged to the horse and always would. Isabella stepped back from the doorway before he could see her. She stood in the corridor with her back to the wall and her arms crossed over her chest and breathed through something she was not going to name. She had prepared herself for many versions of this. Lorenzo indifferent. Lorenzo performatively attentive, going through the motions of interest to prove something to himself. Lorenzo impatient, irritated by the intrusion of a small person into the clean geometry of his life. She had not prepared herself for Lorenzo going still when Sophia spoke, the way a man goes still when he hears something he's been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. It made everything harder. She needed him to be the man she remembered, the one who had calculated the cost of loving her and found it too high. That man was navigable. That man she knew how to stay angry at. This man was something she didn't have a map for. The days settled into a rhythm she resented and couldn't disrupt. Mornings, she worked. Afternoons, Sophia explored, because Sophia had never encountered a space she didn't treat as territory to be claimed, and the estate had a garden, and a library with a rolling ladder, and a kitchen where the cook, a compact woman named Rosa who appeared entirely unbothered by the circumstances of their arrival, let Sophia sit on the counter and watch things being stirred. Lorenzo kept his distance from Isabella. He was courteous in the way of someone following rules he had set for himself, meals at the same table, brief and functional conversation, eyes that never stayed on her long enough to become something she'd have to respond to. He was, she thought, trying. She wasn't sure whether she found this more or less infuriating than if he hadn't bothered. But Sophia he could not resist, and he didn't try. She saw it in increments. The horse on his desk, repositioned to face the room, toward the door Sophia came through, she noted, not toward his chair. A box of colored pencils that appeared in the sitting room without explanation. One evening she came downstairs to find him cross-legged on the library floor with Sophia in his lap, both of them examining a large atlas, Sophia's finger tracing coastlines while Lorenzo named them with a patience she had genuinely never seen in him before. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Something moved across his face, not guilt, not defensiveness, but something more exposed than either. A man caught being something he hadn't decided to be yet. She turned and went back upstairs without speaking. That night she sat on the edge of the bath for a long time, because the bedroom felt too close and the house felt too large, and neither Sophia nor Lorenzo was there to make her feel one particular thing instead of 6 contradictory ones. He had taken everything from her once. Not cruelly, that was the part she'd had to make her peace with, slowly, over years. He hadn't betrayed her out of malice. He had simply chosen his empire, cleanly and completely, the way a surgeon amputates, because he decided the alternative was worse. She had understood it. Understanding it had not made it survivable. She had survived anyway. That was the thing he didn't know, that she had no interest in telling him. What she'd built in the years since, not just Sophia, but herself, the particular self she'd assembled from the wreckage of that first year, was hers. It did not have his name on it. She would not allow this house, however beautiful, however temporary, to start quietly rearranging the furniture of who she had become. She would not allow him to be good at this. But that night, very late, she heard a sound from down the hall. She stood in Sophia's doorway and watched Lorenzo sit in the chair by her daughter's bed in the dark, still dressed, elbows on his knees, watching the girl sleep with an expression that had nothing tactical in it whatsoever. He didn't know she was there. She stood for 10 seconds, maybe 12. Then she went back to her room and closed the door softly and lay down and looked at the ceiling again. The flowers on the dresser were still fresh. Someone changed them daily. She had stopped pretending not to notice who gave the order. She found him on the terrace at 11:30. She hadn't been looking for him. She'd come down for water because the house was warm and she couldn't sleep, and she refused to ring the bedside intercom for something she could get herself. She'd been padding back through the dark sitting room when she saw the terrace doors open and him standing beyond them, a glass of something amber in one hand, his jacket gone, his collar open at the throat. The city glittered below the garden wall. He had his back to her and didn't hear her stop. She should have gone upstairs. She stood in the doorway instead. Can't sleep. He turned without startling, a man who always knew where the exits were and who was standing in them. No. He looked at her for a moment. You. No. He turned back to the city. She crossed the threshold because going back inside suddenly felt like the more deliberate choice, and she was tired of every small decision in this house feeling like a negotiation. She stood at the railing 2 feet from him and looked at Chicago spreading itself out below them, all light and distance, and said nothing. For a while, neither of them did. It was Lorenzo who broke it, which surprised her. He had always been the more patient one, capable of outlasting any silence, any room, any person. She had once watched him sit across a table from a man for 40 minutes without speaking and leave with everything he wanted. Silence was a weapon he knew how to use. This didn't sound like a weapon. I didn't know, he said. About Sophia. He said it to the city, not to her. I need you to know that I didn't know. I know you didn't. He looked at her then. She kept her eyes on the skyline. That's not the same as saying it wasn't my fault, she continued. You made it so I couldn't tell you. That's not an accident. That's architecture. A long pause. Yes, he said. Nothing else. No defense, no qualification. Just the word, sitting there between them like something heavy he'd set down. She had waited 10 years for him to say it. She'd imagined it many times, the confrontation, the things she would say, the particular devastating precision she would bring to the accounting of what he'd done. She had rehearsed it in the way you rehearse things you tell yourself you don't actually want. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined. It felt quieter. Sadder. Like arriving at a place you've been traveling toward for years and finding it smaller than the map suggested. Why did you do it? She asked. Not the official version. I know the official version. I've had a long time to piece it together. She finally turned to look at him. I mean, why? What were you afraid of? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might simply not answer. He had always had that option and had used it freely. But something had changed in him these past days. She'd been cataloging it without meaning to, the way you notice a shift in weather before you can name it. Something had come loose. That you'd be used against me, he said at last. That I'd make a choice for you one day, a real one, your life against something else, and I'd choose wrong. Not because I didn't love you. He stopped. Seemed to weigh whether to continue. Because I did. Because I knew I would. And I didn't trust myself. She looked at him for a long moment. Lorenzo Moretti, who had spent 15 years being the most feared man in Chicago, standing on his own terrace in the dark telling her he had been afraid. It should have felt like a revelation. Instead, it felt like the last piece of a puzzle she had already mostly solved, satisfying only in the grim, tired way of finally confirmed suspicions. So you decided for me, she said. Yes. Without asking. Yes. That's the part one couldn't forgive. She said it without heat, which was the truest way she knew to say it. Not that you left. I could have understood that. I understood it eventually, even if understanding it felt like swallowing glass. She looked back at the city. It was that you decided what I could handle. What I deserved to choose. You took that from me and called it protection. He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. There was no answer that would do anything useful. The wind moved through the garden below them. Somewhere far down on the street, a car alarm started and then stopped. The city breathed its ordinary night breath and paid them no attention. She asked about you, Isabella said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of its own accord, the way things do when you're tired and the dark makes the room feel like a confessional. This afternoon. She asked why you look at her like that. She felt him go still beside her. What did you tell her? I told her you were still figuring some things out. A pause. She said that was okay. That grown-ups take longer. The sound he made was not quite a laugh. It was something smaller and more unguarded than that, something she hadn't heard from him before, or perhaps had once, long ago, before he'd had the chance to polish it away. She's like you, he said quietly. The way she looks at things. Like she's already decided to be interested before she knows what they are. Isabella felt the warmth of it move through her before she could stop it. She pressed her lips together and looked at her hands on the railing. Don't, she said. Softly. I know. I'm not saying never. She hadn't known she was going to say that either. She seemed to have lost some of her editorial control in the dark. I'm saying not yet. I'm saying I'm still. She stopped. Started again. I'm still carrying a lot of it. And you being good at this, Lorenzo, she gestured vaguely at the house, at the city, at the bronze horse with its new name and the daily flowers and the chair pulled up beside Sophia's bed in the dark. It doesn't cancel what was. It just complicates it. I know, he said again. And then, I'm not asking you to forget it. Good. Because I won't. I know that too. She almost smiled. Almost. She felt it move through her and made no attempt to stop the feeling, only the expression. They stood there a while longer. Not talking. Not talking in the weighted, tactical way of earlier in the week, but in a different way, the way of two people who have said the difficult things and arrived, not at resolution, but at the first coordinates of something that might eventually lead there. She went inside first. At the doorway she stopped without turning. Rocket, she said. A beat. Good name, Lorenzo said. She went upstairs. She lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt the tight thing in her chest, the one she had been carrying since Michigan Avenue, since the car, since the first night in this house, loosened by exactly 1 degree. 1 degree was not forgiveness. She knew that. 1 degree was barely a beginning. But she had been cold for a long time, and she was tired, and the flowers on the dresser were fresh, and somewhere down the hall a man she had never fully stopped loving was sitting with something he didn't know how to hold yet, trying to learn. She closed her eyes. For the first time since it all began, she slept. He found the leak on a Tuesday, the way you find most things that have been hiding in plain sight, by finally looking at what you'd been choosing not to see. It started with a number. Dante brought it to him just after 6 in the morning, while the house was still quiet and the garden was still gray with early light. A call logged from an internal line at 2:47 a.m. duration. For minutes, 11 seconds. The receiving number was a burner, prepaid, already dead, but the routing signature matched a relay the council's communications people had been using since last spring. Lorenzo had made it his business to know their infrastructure. He knew their signatures the way a cardiologist knows an arrhythmia. He looked at the originating extension. He looked at it for a long time. Marco Fieri had been with him for 7 years. Not as long as Dante, but longer than almost anyone else. He had been at Lorenzo's right hand through the consolidation of the South Side, through the Bratva negotiation, through the 3 years of careful, grinding expansion that had made the Moretti name into something the city's other families said quietly and without decoration. He was 34 years old, quick-minded, loyal in the way Lorenzo had always valued most, not out of fear, but out of something that looked like genuine investment. It had looked like that. Lorenzo now understood the distinction. He didn't summon Marco immediately. That was an impulse, and Lorenzo had spent his entire adult life learning to let impulses arrive and then watching them leave without acting on them. Instead, he spent 2 hours pulling threads, phone records, access logs, the particular sequencing of small decisions that, laid out in order, told a story that could not be explained as coincidence. Marco had been in the room when Lorenzo decided to bring Isabella and Sofia to the estate. Marco had been in the room when Lorenzo discussed the guest wing configuration with Dante. Marco had logged a 4-minute call to the council at 2:47 a.m., 9 days after a truck had nearly killed his daughter on Michigan Avenue. By 8 o'clock, Lorenzo had the complete picture. He sat with it for a few minutes in the way he sat with difficult things, without flinching, without rushing toward resolution, simply looking at it directly until he had absorbed all of what it was. Then he called Dante. He handled it quietly, which was the only way he knew how to handle things he felt. Marco was removed from the estate before 9. The conversation was brief. Lorenzo said very little. He had found, over the years, that silence in those moments carried more weight than anything he could add to it, that men who had betrayed him understood their situation more completely in the absence of his anger than they ever would inside it. Marco left pale and without his phone. The men who escorted him would ensure he had no opportunity to make further contact. The damage, however, was already done. That was the thing about leaks. You could find the source and seal it and still be standing in a flooding room. By 10 o'clock, Dante confirmed what Lorenzo had already calculated. The council had the address. They had had it for at least 6 days, which meant they had been watching, waiting, assembling, deciding not on whether to move, but on when and how. The drive-by on Michigan Avenue had been improvised, opportunistic, a shot taken because the moment presented itself. What came next would not be improvised. He was standing in the study with this information, turning it over, when Sofia appeared in the doorway. She did that. She arrived in places without apparent transit, the way small children do, one moment absent, the next simply present, as if the geography between locations didn't apply to her. She was in her pajamas still, her hair tangled from sleep, the teddy bear hanging from one fist. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You have your serious face," she said. He had not known he had a serious face, distinct from his other faces, until a 4-year-old catalogued it. "Do I? Mama makes the same one when the internet isn't working." She considered him. "Is your internet not working?" "Something like that," he said. She nodded, satisfied with this, and wandered toward the bronze horse on his desk. He watched her touch it, one careful finger along the curve of the neck, proprietary and gentle. Rocket. He had started thinking of it that way without noticing the transition. He needed to tell Isabella. The thought arrived with a particular weight, because telling Isabella meant admitting that the thing he had promised her, safety, the one currency he actually had to offer, had been compromised from inside. That someone he trusted had made her daughter a target with a 4-minute phone call at 3 in the morning. That the golden cage, for all its heated floors and fresh flowers and rolling library ladders, had been porous all along. He found her in the kitchen with Rosa, both of them holding coffee, the morning light doing something complicated to the angles of her face. She looked rested in a way she hadn't since she arrived, and he hated that he was about to take that from her. "I need a minute," he said. She read him immediately. The coffee cup lowered. Rosa found something important to do in the pantry. He told her cleanly, without cushioning. The call, the timing, what it meant. He watched her process it the same way she'd processed the bullet in the car, not with panic, but with a rapid, unflinching intake of reality, her mind visibly moving through the implications before he'd finished laying them out. "How long do we have?" she asked when he stopped. "I don't know. They're deliberate. They won't move without a plan. But they'll move." "Yes." She set the cup down, looked at the window, at the garden beyond it, at Sophia's small handprints still smudged on the lower pane from yesterday afternoon. She stood with her back straight and her hands flat on the counter and worked through something internal that he could see the shape of, but not the detail. "This is what you knew would happen," she said. Not an accusation. An observation, offered with the precision of a woman who has been doing her own accounting. "When you were 28 and you decided I was a liability. This is what you were afraid of." The truth of it moved through him, complicated and unwelcome. "Yes. And you were right," she said. She turned to look at him. "About the risk. You were right about that. I was wrong about the solution." Something shifted in her face, brief, almost imperceptible, but he was watching. 10 years ago, he had been watching her the same way, reading the same small seismic movements, and then he had closed his eyes to all of it by choice. He had no intention of doing that again. "We need to move her," Isabella said. "We need to move both of you." "Where?" He had already been working on that. There was a property outside the city, a place not even Dante had full coordinates for, a contingency he had built precisely for the scenario where his primary location became compromised. He had built it years ago and hoped never to need it. He had built it alone, which now turned out to matter enormously. "Somewhere with no Marco," he said. She nodded once. Then she pushed off the counter and walked toward the hallway, toward Sophia, toward the business of packing a life into a bag again. Something she had already done once this week and was doing now with the level efficiency of a woman who had long ago learned not to be precious about her circumstances. At the door she paused. "Lorenzo." He looked up. "Find out who gave the order," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely without tremor. "Not just who made the call. Who gave the order?" He held her gaze. In 10 years, he had not forgotten what she was capable of, the particular quality of her when she had decided something completely. "I intend to," he said. She left. He stood in the kitchen in the morning light and listened to the sound of the house rearranging itself around a threat that was no longer theoretical, and felt the cold, familiar clarity of a man who has run out of things to protect except the ones that actually matter. It was, he thought, the most focused he had felt in years. They drove for 2 hours before the property appeared. It sat on 40 acres of woodlands north of the city, a low, serious house built from stone and timber, the kind of structure that had been designed to be forgettable from the road and impenetrable from every other direction. No gates with crests. No statement. Just a gravel track through old trees and then, suddenly, a house that meant it. Lorenzo had bought it under a name that didn't exist through a lawyer who had since retired and moved to Portugal. He had told no one. Not even Dante knew the full coordinates until this morning. Sophia was asleep before they cleared the county line. Isabella watched the trees and said nothing for most of the drive, which he had come to understand was not coldness, but the way she moved through logistical difficulty, internally, efficiently, without requiring anything from the room. The house was cold when they arrived. It hadn't been opened in 8 months. Dante's team swept it in 20 minutes while Lorenzo built a fire in the main room, because the heating would take time and Sophia was already stirring, and there were some things he could do immediately, and he preferred to do them. By the time Isabella brought her inside, the fire was established and the room was warming, and Dante's people had fanned into the tree line without being asked. Sophia walked in, assessed the space with the grave thoroughness of a property surveyor, and announced that it smelled like a forest. "It does," Lorenzo agreed. "I like it," she said, and moved on, which was how Sophia resolved most things quickly, without residue, ready for the next one. He envied it. The trouble came that afternoon. Isabella was on a call in the back bedroom, navigating the professional wreckage of a week that had comprehensively derailed her life, and Lorenzo was at the kitchen table with his laptop when he heard it, a sound from outside, sudden and sharp. The crack of a branch under something heavier than a deer. He was on his feet before he'd made the decision to stand. Then he heard Sophia. She had gone out the side door to the garden without telling anyone, a lapse in supervision that cost him approximately 4 years of life in the second before he saw her through the window, standing perfectly fine on the flagstone path, staring at the tree line with wide eyes. She had heard the sound too. She was frozen in exactly the way she had been frozen on Michigan Avenue, very still, very uncertain, on the edge of something she didn't know how to move through. He was outside in 3 strides. Dante materialized at the far edge of the garden within seconds, a hand signal, a shake of his head. A deer. Just a deer, moving through the brush on the north side. Nothing. Lorenzo let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Sophia turned and looked up at him. Her chin was doing the thing he'd seen it do twice before, the fine, barely controlled trembling that preceded tears she was trying very hard not to release. "I got scared," she said, as if confessing something. He lowered himself to one knee on the cold flagstone so that he was level with her, which was not a position he had occupied in recent memory in relation to anyone. The gravel pressed through his trouser leg. He didn't adjust. "I know," he said. "My heart went really fast. That happens. That's supposed to happen." She looked at him with the particular attention she gave things she was deciding whether to believe. "It doesn't happen to you," she said. He considered the honest answer. "It happened to me on the street," he said. "When I saw you in the road. My heart went very fast." She absorbed this. "But you didn't freeze." "No." "How?" He thought about it the way he thought about things he'd never had to put into words before, carefully, because she deserved a real answer, and he had learned in a very short time that she would know the difference between a real answer and the shape of one. "I moved before the scared part arrived," he said. "Brave isn't not being scared. It's doing the thing while the scared part is still catching up." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. The chin had steadied. "So I have to go faster than the scared," she said. "That's it exactly." "What if the scared is very fast?" "Then you practice," he said. "You practice until your feet know what to do before your brain has to tell them." She looked at the tree line, then back at him. Something had shifted in her face, the frozen quality gone, replaced by the considering look he was coming to recognize as her version of resolution. She reached out and put her hand in his, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who has not yet learned to make a production of need, and turned to face the trees. "We could practice now," she said. He looked at her small hand in his. He had held this hand once before in the road, in the chaos, not knowing whose hand it was. He knew now. The knowledge moved through him the way it kept moving through him, in waves, each one finding him slightly less braced than the last. "We could," he said. They stood there together and looked at the tree line, the afternoon light falling through the branches, the shadows shifting, nothing in them but winter and wind and the ordinary depth of a forest doing what forests do. He showed her how to breathe. "Slow down," he said. "Count to 4 on the way in. Hold it. 4 on the way out. Your body thinks it's in danger because your heart is fast. You slow your heart, your body gets the new information." She tried it. Her small chest rose and fell with enormous concentration. "It's working," she said, with the wonder of someone discovering a mechanism. "It always works," he said. "It just takes a second." She tried it again. And again. Then she looked up at him with those amber eyes that still, even now, sent a crack through the composed surface of everything he thought he was. "You should teach Mama," she said. "She does the scared breathing when she thinks I'm asleep." The thought of Isabella in the dark, doing the scared breathing while Sophia slept, moved through him in a way that had no name in his vocabulary, something between grief and responsibility and a tenderness so unfamiliar it felt almost like pain. "Maybe I will," he said. Sophia, satisfied, released his hand and turned back to the garden with the decisive energy of a child who has processed what she needed to process and is ready to move on. She crouched to investigate something in the flagstone's edge, a beetle, he saw, moving with great purpose toward the grass. He stayed on one knee a moment longer than necessary, watching her. This was what he had been afraid of. Not the enemies, not the council, not the elaborate machinery of violence that had been his professional landscape for 15 years. This. A beetle on a flagstone. A small hand in his. The way it felt to be needed by someone who had not calculated the cost of needing him and would not have understood the calculation if you tried to explain it. This was the liability he had amputated himself from a decade ago. On his knees on the cold stone, Lorenzo Moretti looked at his daughter and understood, fully and without the option of retreat, that he had been wrong about what strength required. He had been building walls when he should have been building this. It happened in the 12 minutes he wasn't watching. He had been running the perimeter with Dante, a habit, twice daily, the kind of discipline that had kept him alive long enough to become the sort of man who needed to run perimeters. The house was locked. The team was posted. Sophia was asleep, finally, after an afternoon that had wrung her small body into exhaustion. Isabella had been in the main room with her laptop and a cup of tea gone cold, doing the quiet, methodical work of maintaining a life that had been comprehensively disrupted. 12 minutes. He came back through the side door and knew before he crossed the threshold. The way you know, not from evidence, not yet, but from the particular quality of a space that has changed in your absence. The tea was on the table. The laptop was open. The chair was pushed back at an angle that was not how Isabella left chairs. The back door was ajar. 2 inches. The cold coming through it. He crossed the room in 4 strides and was through the door and into the dark of the rear garden before Dante had finished saying his name. The tree line was 30 feet away. Beyond it, nothing. No sound, no movement, nothing that his eyes or training could resolve into information he could use. He stood very still and felt something he had not felt in 15 years of running a criminal empire. He felt helpless. It lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the phone in his jacket buzzed. The number was one he recognized not because he had it saved, but because he had spent considerable resources mapping it. Victor Wren. 51 years old. Czech by birth, Chicagoan by ambition, council seat inherited through a combination of longevity and strategic murder. He had wanted the South Side for 6 years and had been patient about it in the methodical, unhurried way of men who are confident that time is on their side. Lorenzo answered on the second ring. Moretti. Wren's voice was pleasant, which was the most dangerous thing about him. He had the warmth of a man who genuinely enjoyed what he did. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Lorenzo said nothing. He had learned this from Wren himself, watching him across tables over the years, that silence asked questions words couldn't. "She's fine," Wren said, reading the silence correctly. Unhurt, comfortable, extremely displeased with her current situation, which a brief, appreciative pause tells me a great deal about the kind of woman she is. "I can see why you kept her close. What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. The South Distribution Network. The Meridian contracts. And your formal withdrawal from the council vote on the harbor expansion." A pause. "In exchange, she goes home. Tonight. Clean." Lorenzo walked back into the house. Through the main room, up the stairs, to the door of the room where Sophia was sleeping. He pushed it open an inch. The small shape under the covers, the bear tucked beside her, the soft sound of her breathing in the dark. He pulled the door closed without a sound. "I'll need proof of life," he said. There was a brief silence on the line, and then Isabella's voice controlled, the particular controlled of a person managing themselves under conditions that would undo most people. "I'm here. I'm not hurt. Sophia." "She's safe," he said. "She's asleep." A beat. He heard her exhale, the specific exhale of a woman releasing the one fear she had not been able to contain. And the sound of it did something to the architecture of his chest that he had no time for and filed away with the precision of a man who intends to revisit it. Ren came back on the line. "You have 6 hours. I'll send a location." The call ended. Lorenzo stood in the corridor outside Sophia's room for 30 seconds. Exactly 30. He had always found that the correct response to the worst moments was not haste, but the deliberate, forcing pause, the kind that separates reaction from decision and ensures that what follows is the latter. Then he went downstairs and found Dante. "Ren," he said. That was sufficient. Dante had been building this same map of the council's infrastructure for 3 years. He would know what it meant and what it required. "The girl?" Dante asked. "Asleep. She doesn't know." He looked at his second. "Keep it that way." "And the terms?" Lorenzo looked at him steadily. The terms were what they were, an ultimatum designed by a man who believed he had correctly identified Lorenzo's weakness and had positioned himself to exploit it. The South Network. The Meridian contracts. The Harbor vote. The accumulated work of a decade, offered up or Isabella doesn't come home. Ren believed Lorenzo would fold. That was the bet. It was, if you had been watching Lorenzo Moretti for the past 15 years, a reasonable bet. A man protects his empire. That was the axiom. That was the architecture of everything he'd built. When pushed, he chose the empire. He had proven it once already at 28, when the choice had been Isabella's safety against the cost of keeping her close. He had chosen the empire. He had spent 10 years paying for it in the quiet, compound interest way of decisions that never fully leave the ledger. "We're not meeting his terms," Lorenzo said. Dante didn't blink. "Then we go get her. We go get her." He went back upstairs to Sophia's room and opened the door again, fully this time, stepping inside, standing in the dark beside the bed. She was on her back with one arm flung over her head, the bear wedged under her chin, deeply and absolutely asleep with the total commitment of small children who have no unfinished business to keep them at the surface. He had never had anyone to fight for. Not like this. He had fought for territory, for position, for the abstract continuation of an enterprise he had decided to make his identity. Those were things worth protecting because he had decided they were, and decisions made by Lorenzo Moretti tended to become facts. This was different. This was not a decision. This was the only possible answer to a question he hadn't known he was being asked until a runaway truck on Michigan Avenue made it unavoidable. He reached down and very lightly, with one finger, straightened the bear, repositioned it so it wouldn't slide out from under her chin when she moved. It was a small thing. The kind of small thing he had never done for anyone in his life and would have found, 2 weeks ago, entirely foreign to the vocabulary of who he was. It felt, now, like the most natural thing he had ever done. He left her sleeping and went back downstairs to the kitchen table, where Dante had already spread out a city map and was on his phone pulling coordinates from a source Lorenzo didn't need to ask about. The team was assembling. The machinery was in motion. On the table beside the map, he noticed Isabella's cold cup of tea, still sitting where she'd left it. Still in the ring it had made on the wood. He thought about the terrace. The way she'd set his name in the dark, without the weight it used to carry. The 1 degree of warmth she had allowed herself, and the careful, honest way she'd named it. He thought about a 4-year-old teaching herself to breathe slower than the fear. He picked up the phone and looked at the incoming location Ren's people had just sent. A warehouse in the old meatpacking district. Of course. Men like Ren had no imagination, only appetite. He set the phone down and looked at Dante. "How many do we need?" Dante considered. "To go in clean and bring her out clean? 8. Maybe 10. Take 12, Lorenzo said. We do this once. He put on his jacket. He checked the weapon at his hip with the brief, practiced efficiency of a man who has done it 10,000 times and hopes, very privately, that this is the last time it needs to mean what it means. Then he walked out into the cold night to go and get her back. The meatpacking district was quiet at 2 in the morning in the particular way of places that have absorbed too much history to bother being loud about it. Lorenzo approached it the way he approached everything that mattered, from the outside in, patiently, having already mapped the interior in his head before his feet touched the ground. Dante had pulled the building's original permits, cross-referenced them with satellite imagery, and plotted 4 entry points in the 40 minutes between the property and the city. Lorenzo had spent the drive not talking, which his team understood to mean he was working, which he was. He was also, beneath the working, doing something he had not done since he was 19 years old and newly in over his head. He was afraid. Not the performance of it, not the useful, tactical awareness of danger that he had long ago domesticated into a professional tool. The real thing. The cold, animal variety that lives in the body rather than the mind and cannot be reasoned with, only survived. He let it be there. He didn't fight it. He had told Sophia that Brave was moving before the scared part arrived. Tonight the scared part had arrived first, and he was moving anyway, which he supposed was the same lesson from a different angle. They went in through the east loading dock at 2:14. 12 men, moving in the compressed, wordless choreography of people who have trained for exactly this kind of darkness. Lorenzo was not at the rear, where a man of his position was traditionally placed, protected, directing, removed from the immediate consequence of his own decisions. He was third through the door, behind Dante and a former military contractor named Reyes who had worked for Lorenzo for 4 years and had never once asked a question he didn't need the answer to. The warehouse was large and poorly lit, the kind of space that had been chosen precisely because its layout favored concealment over efficiency. Ren's people had prepared. Lorenzo had expected that. He had prepared for the preparation. What followed was not the cinematic choreography that men who have not been in these situations imagine. It was fast, disorienting, conducted mostly in darkness, punctuated by the narrow beams of tactical lights and the sounds of a building being moved through by people on both sides who understood the stakes. Lorenzo took a position behind a steel column and covered the left flank while Dante's team pushed through the center. He fired twice, controlled, precise, without the adrenaline surge that used to accompany it in his earlier years, and had since been trained into something quieter and more deliberate. He did not think about what he was doing. He thought about where Isabella was. Reyes found her in 7 minutes. The call came through the earpiece, clear, 2 words, "She's here." Lorenzo was moving before the second word finished. Across the warehouse floor, past the aftermath of the entry, through an interior door and down a short corridor to a room that had been a foreman's office and was now functioning as something significantly worse. She was zip-tied to a chair. Not hurt, Ren had been telling the truth about that, which was either professional courtesy or a strategic calculation about the value of undamaged leverage. Her coat was torn at the shoulder. There was a bruise forming along her jaw that hadn't been there in the kitchen, which told him the extraction from the property had not been as clean as Ren's pleasant voice had implied. Reyes had already cut her wrists free by the time Lorenzo reached the door. She stood, looked at her hands for a moment, the red marks where the ties had been, and then looked up. Her eyes found his across the room and stayed there, and in the 3 seconds before either of them moved or spoke, he watched her run the same assessment she had run in every difficult moment since Michigan Avenue, taking in the full situation, measuring what was real, arriving at the truth of it without flinching. He crossed the room. He did not stop at a professional distance. He put his hands on either side of her face carefully, because of the bruise, tilting her head slightly so that he could see it properly in the light from the doorway, and looked at her the way he had not let himself look at her since the terrace. "The bruise," he said. "I'm fine. Isabella." "I'm fine, Lorenzo." Her voice was steady. Her hands, he noticed, had come up and closed around his wrists, not pushing him away, just holding on, the way Sophia had held his lapel in the road. Sophia. Safe. Asleep. Dante has people with her, people I trust with my own life, which tonight that's what it is. She exhaled. The long, total kind. Her eyes closed briefly and then opened again, and when they did, something in them had shifted. The emergency composure, that magnificent and exhausting architecture she had been maintaining since this all began, came down by one more degree. You came yourself, she said. Not a question. An observation, offered with a precision he recognized, the way she named things she needed to look at directly. Yes. You didn't have to do that. You have people for... I know. She looked at him. He was aware that his hands were still on her face and that he had not moved them, and that she had not asked him to. The warehouse was loud with the sounds of resolution, Dante's voice in the corridor, the efficient, professional aftermath of a situation being closed. None of it touched the small, still space the two of them were standing in. He thought you'd take the deal, she said. I know what he thought. What changed? He considered the full answer. The terrace. The beetle on the flagstone. A bronze horse with a new name. A child teaching herself to breathe slower than the fear while her father held her hand and understood, kneeling on cold stone, that he had been wrong about everything that mattered. There was too much of it to say, and none of it was wrong, but all of it reduced, finally, to one thing. You were always worth more than the empire, he said. I was just too afraid to know it. She was quiet for a moment. Her thumbs moved once against his wrists, a small, involuntary thing that she may not have been aware of, but he was aware of everything tonight, every small seismic movement, because he had spent too long training himself not to notice, and he was done with that particular discipline. That's going to take me some time, she said. I know. I can't just. Isabella. Gentle. I know. I'm not asking you to do it tonight. I'm not asking you to do anything tonight except let me take you home. Home. The word landed between them with a weight neither of them examined, because examining it here, in a warehouse at 2 a.m. with the bruise forming along her jaw and his hands still on her face, was more than the moment could hold. He filed it away. He was good at that. He intended to take it back out somewhere quieter and look at it properly. She gave a small nod. He dropped his hands slowly, the way you withdraw from something fragile, and stepped back. At the door to the corridor, she stopped and turned back. He expected a question. A condition. One of the careful, precisely worded terms she had been setting since Michigan Avenue, each one reasonable, each one a necessary piece of the accounting between them. Instead, she said, Your jacket is ruined. He looked down. The left sleeve. He hadn't noticed. He looked back up. And Isabella Vance, 12 days after a truck nearly killed their daughter on Michigan Avenue, standing in a former foreman's office in the meatpacking district with a bruise on her jaw and her wrists still red from the zip ties, almost smiled. It was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 10 years. He followed her out into the corridor, into the noise and the light and the complicated, unfinished business of everything that came next, and felt something he had believed he'd permanently excised settle back into his chest like a key finding its lock. Not peace. Not yet. But the first architecture of it. The beginning of something built to last. The transition took 3 months. That was the honest answer, the one he gave himself when he was being precise about it rather than romantic. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of renunciation, no ceremony, no table where he laid down his authority like a weapon he decided to stop carrying. That was not how these things worked, and Lorenzo Moretti had never had much patience for the version of his world that existed in the imagination of people who hadn't lived in it. Power was not a coat you removed when the weather changed. It was restructured, redistributed, handed off in increments to men who had been built over years for exactly this purpose and who understood, because Lorenzo made it unambiguous. that the transfer was permanent and that any attempt to interpret it as weakness would be the last strategic error of their professional lives. Dante took the South Network. He had been running it in practice for 2 years. The formality was almost administrative. The council seat was relinquished without ceremony at a meeting Lorenzo attended in person, which surprised them. He had expected them to push back. They did not. Men who have spent years calculating the cost of challenging Lorenzo Moretti tend to recalibrate quickly when he walks into a room and closes a door himself that they had always assumed he would never close voluntarily. Voluntary was the part they hadn't planned for. Ren, he dealt with separately. Quietly. With a thoroughness that required no further discussion. By the end of the 3rd month, Lorenzo Moretti, the Iron King, architect of 15 years of careful, grinding dominion over the most contested territory in Chicago, was, in the operational sense, a private citizen. He found it stranger than he had expected and less devastating than he had feared. The property north of the city became theirs in the way that places become yours, not through a single decision, but through accumulation. Sophia's handprints appeared on the kitchen window again, deliberate this time, pressed there one Saturday morning with muddy hands while Lorenzo stood beside her, and neither of them mentioned that it was exactly what they'd done at the estate, because some things don't need to be named to be understood. Rosa came up from the city twice a week and filled the kitchen with smells that softened the stone and timber severity of the house into something that was beginning, tentatively, to feel inhabited rather than fortified. Isabella took the back bedroom as her office. She had her work, which she had maintained with a dedication he respected and had quietly ensured was supported, a word in the right direction, a complication smoothed before it arrived, things she didn't know about and he didn't advertise. She would have objected to the intervention. He had decided to carry the objection on her behalf and accept the accounting of it when it arrived, because some forms of care are worth the argument they'll eventually cost you. The argument arrived on a Tuesday in February. It was, as he had anticipated, precise and thoroughly sourced. He listened to all of it. He apologized for exactly the parts that warranted an apology and declined to apologize for the rest, which he explained with the same directness he had always used when he believed he was right. She told him that was infuriating. He said he knew. She almost smiled. He was getting better at reading almost. Sophia adapted the way Sophia adapted to everything, immediately, thoroughly, without apparent grief for whatever had come before. She assigned the property its own internal geography within the first week. The garden was the kingdom, the library was the tower, the kitchen was Rosa's domain, and entry required tribute in the form of one question answered honestly. A toll Rosa accepted with equanimity and occasionally gamed by asking things about Lorenzo's childhood that he hadn't thought about in 30 years. He answered them. That surprised him most, not that she asked, but that he found he wanted to. That there was someone small and utterly without judgment sitting on a kitchen counter eating Rosa's biscuits who deserved to know where he had come from, and that telling her felt less like excavation and more like finally doing something useful with the material. He told her about his father's hands. About the neighborhood where he grew up, which was nothing like this property and had smelled nothing like a forest. About the first time he understood that the world was organized by power rather than merit and had decided, at 11 years old, to become the kind of person who had both. Sophia had listened to all of this with the focused gravity she brought to important things. Then she had said, "Did you have a bear?" He had not had a bear. She had taken the teddy, her constant, her anchor, the thing that had been in her arms on Michigan Avenue when the world had narrowed to 30 tons of steel and one small figure standing in its path, and placed it in his hands with the ceremonial seriousness of a bequest. "You can borrow him," she said, "when you miss it." He had held the bear for a moment. It was lighter than it looked. "Thank you," he said. He meant it in more directions than she could know. With Isabella it was slower, which was correct. They were not young, and neither of them was interested in performing a reconciliation that hadn't actually happened yet. What they built instead was something more durable than performance, a series of ordinary evenings that accumulated weight the way ordinary evenings do when the people in them have decided, without announcing it, to stop holding back. He cooked on Thursdays, badly, which Sophia found hilarious and Isabella pretended not to. He learned to leave her coffee exactly the temperature she preferred, which required a specific sequence he had mapped through observation over several weeks, because asking directly would have felt like asking permission to know her. And he was trying not to make her feel that everything was a negotiation. She started sitting beside him instead of across from him. He noticed. He said nothing. He understood that she was doing the accounting in her own time and that his role was to be consistently, quietly present while she completed it, to be, in the language of the man he used to be, patient. Not the tactical patience of a negotiator. The other kind. The kind that doesn't calculate a return. One evening in April she came to stand beside him on the terrace, the stone one at the north property, smaller than the estates, but with the same quality of dark and distance, and leaned her shoulder against his without preamble or explanation. He put his arm around her without preamble or explanation. The city was far enough away to be only light. The trees were beginning to come back from the winter. Below in the garden, Sophia had left her ball where she'd been playing that afternoon, a bright red sphere sitting in the new grass like a full stop. They stood like that for a long time without speaking. Eventually Isabella said, "Rosa told Sophia that you cried the first time she called you Dad." A pause. Rosa has a generous interpretation of the word cried. She said you turned away and were very still for almost a minute. He looked at the trees. Rosa should find a different hobby. Isabella's shoulder pressed fractionally warmer against his. "I think it's the best thing I've ever heard about you," she said quietly. He had no answer for that. He found, standing there in the April dark with her shoulder against his and Sophia's ball sitting in the new grass below, and the rest of his life arranged in front of him like territory he had not yet learned the full shape of, that he didn't need one. The Iron King was a name that belonged to a man who had believed that softness was the enemy of survival. Lorenzo Moretti, standing on a terrace in the early spring with the woman he had loved for 15 years and the daughter who had taught him what brave actually required, understood that he had been wrong about survival too. You did not survive alone. You endured alone. Surviving, the real kind, the kind that meant something when you looked back at it, required exactly what he had spent 15 years amputating from himself. It required someone to hold the bear for. Someone to come home to. Someone small and certain and entirely unbothered by who you used to be, who puts her muddy handprints on your window and calls it art and is completely right. He held Isabella a little closer. Below them, the garden was dark and quiet and alive with early spring, and the red ball sat in the grass waiting for morning, and somewhere inside the house Sophia was sleeping with the absolute commitment of a child who knows, in the wordless way children know the most important things, that she is exactly where she is supposed to be. So was he. For the first time in his life, completely, without caveat, without the waiting for the cost of it to arrive, so was he.